Chapter 8 of the Riddle of the Sands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gesine. The Riddle of the Sands by Erskine Childers. Chapter 8 The Theory. Davies leaned back and gave a deep sigh, as though he still felt the relief from some tension. I did the same, and felt the same relief. The chart, freed from the pressure of our fingers, rolled up with a flip, as though to say, "What do you think of that?" I have straightened out his sentences a little, for in the excitement of his story they had grown more and more jerky and elliptical. "What about Dollmann?" I asked. "Of course," said Davies. "What about him? I didn't get at much that night. It was all so sudden. The only thing I could have sworn to from the first was that he had purposely left me in the lurch that day. I pieced out the rest in the next few days, which I'll just finish with as shortly as I can. Bartels came aboard next morning, and though it was blowing hard, we still managed to shift the Dulcibella to a place where she dried safely at the midday low water, and we could get at her rudder. The lower screw plate on the stern post had wrenched out, and we botched it up roughly as a makeshift. There were other little breakages, but nothing to matter, and the loss of the jib was nothing, as I had 2 spare ones. The dinghy was past repair just then, and I lashed it on deck. It turned out that Bartels was carrying apples from Bremen to Kappeln, in this fjord, and had run into that channel in the sands for shelter from the weather. Today he was bound for the Eider River, whence, as I told you, you can get through, by river and canal, into the Baltic. Of course the Elbe route, by the new Kaiser Wilhelm ship canal, is the shortest. The Eider route is the old one, but he hoped to get rid of some of his apples at Tonning, the town at its mouth. Both routes touch the Baltic at Kiel. As you know, I had been running for the Elbe, but yesterday's muck-up put me off, and I changed my mind, I'll tell you why presently, and decided to sail to the Eider along with the Johannes and get through that way. It cleared from the east next day, and I raced him there, winning hands down, left him at Tonning, and in 3 days was in the Baltic. It was just a week after I ran ashore that I wired to you. You see, I had come to the conclusion that that chap was a spy. In the end it came out quite quietly and suddenly, and left me in profound amazement. I wired to you, that chap was a spy. It was the close association of these 2 ideas that hit me hardest at the moment. For a second I was back in the dreary splendour of the London club room, spelling out that crabbed scrawl from Davies and fastidiously criticising its proposal in the light of a holiday. Holiday? What was to be its issue? Chilling and opaque as the fog that filtered through the skylight, there flooded my imagination a mist of doubt and fear. A spy? I repeated blankly. What do you mean? Why did you wire me? A spy of what? Of whom? I'll tell you how I worked it out, said Davies. I don't think spy is the right word, but I mean something pretty bad. He purposely put me ashore. I don't think I'm suspicious by nature, but I know something about boats and the sea. I know he could have kept close to me if he had chosen, and I saw the whole place at low water when we left those sands on the 2nd day. Look at the chart again. Here's the Hohenhörn bank that I showed you as blocking the road. It's in 2 pieces, first the west and then the east. You see the Telte channel dividing into 2 branches and curving round it. Both branches are broad and deep, as channels go in those waters. Now, in sailing in, I was nowhere near either of them. When I last saw Dollmann, he must have been steering straight for the bank itself, at a point somewhere here, quite a mile from the northern arm of the channel, and 2 from the southern. I followed by compass, as you know, and found nothing but breakers ahead. How did I get through? That's where the luck came in. I spoke of only 2 channels, that is, round the bank, one to the north, the other to the south. But look closely, and you'll see that right through the centre of the West Hohenhörn runs another, a very narrow and winding one, so small that I hadn't even noticed it the night before, when I was going over the chart. That was the one I stumbled into, in that tailor's fashion, as I was groping along the edge of the surf in a desperate effort to gain time. I bolted down it blindly, came out into this strip of open water, crossed that aimlessly, and brought up on the edge of the East Hohenhörn here. It was more than I deserved. I can see now that it was 100 to 1 in favour of my striking on a bad place outside, where I should have gone to pieces in 3 minutes. "And how did Dollmann go?" I asked. "It's as clear as possible," Davies answered. "He doubled back into the northern channel when he had misled me enough. Do you remember my saying that when I last saw him I thought he had luffed and showed his broadside? I had another bit of luck in that. He was luffing towards the north, so it struck me through the blur, and when I in my turn came up to the bank, and had to turn one way or the other to avoid it, I think I should naturally have turned north too, as he had done. In that case I should have been done for I should have had a mile of the bank to skirt before reaching the North Channel, and should have driven ashore long before I got there. But as a matter of fact, I turned south." "Why?" "Couldn't help it. I was running on the starboard tack, boom over to port. To turn north would have meant a jibe, and as things were I couldn't risk one. It was blowing like fits. If anything had carried away, I should have been on shore in a jiffy. I scarcely thought about it at all, but put the helm down and turned her south. Though I knew nothing about it, that little central channel was now on my port hand, distant about 2 cables. The whole thing was luck from beginning to end. Helped by pluck, I thought to myself, as I tried with my landsman's fancy to conjure up that perilous scene. As to the truth of the affair, the chart and Davies's version were easy enough to follow, but I felt only half convinced. The spy, as Davies strangely called his pilot, might have honestly mistaken the course himself, outstripped his convoy inadvertently, and escaped disaster as narrowly as she did. I suggested this on the spur of the moment, but Davies was impatient. "Wait till you hear the whole thing," he said. "I must go back to when I first met him. I told you that on that first evening he began by being as rude as a bear and as cold as stone, and then became suddenly friendly. I can see now that in the talk that followed he was pumping me hard. It was an easy game to play, for I hadn't seen a gentleman since Morrison left me, I was tremendously keen about my voyage, and I thought the chap was a good sportsman, even if he was a bit dark about the ducks. I talked quite freely, at least as freely as I could with my bad German, about my last fortnight's sailing, how I had been smelling out all the channels in and out of the islands, how interested I had been in the whole business, puzzling out the effects of the winds on the tides, the set of the currents, and so on. I talked about my difficulties too, the changes in the buoys, the prehistoric rottenness of the English charts. He drew me out as much as he could, and in the light of what followed, I can see the point of scores of his questions. The next day and the next I saw a good deal of him, and the same thing went on. And then there were my plans for the future. My idea was, as I told you, to go on exploring the German coast just as I had the Dutch. His idea, heavens how plainly I see it now, was to choke me off, get me to clear out altogether from that part of the coast. That was why he said there were no ducks. That was why he cracked up the Baltic as a cruising ground and shooting ground. And that was why he broached and stuck to that plan of sailing in company direct to the Elbe. It was to see me clear. He improved on that. Yes, but after that it's guesswork. I mean that I can't tell when he first decided to go one better and drown me. He couldn't count for certain on bad weather, though he held my nose to it when it came. But granted that he wanted to get rid of me altogether, he got a magnificent chance on that trip to the Elbe lightship. I expect it struck him suddenly, and he acted on the impulse. Left to myself I was all right, but the short-cut was a grand idea of his. Everything was in his favour, wind, sea, sand, tide. He thinks I'm dead. "But the crew," I said. "What about the crew?" "That's another thing. When he first hove to, waiting for me, of course they were on deck. 2 of them, I think.